Welcome back to Centennial Conversations, a series of podcasts about the first 100 years of Gavilan College. I'm Doug Achterman, head librarian at Gavilan, and we're here with history professor Leah Halper, author of To Dream on Your Behalf, A History of Gavilan College. In our last podcast, we talked about the 1960s, a turbulent time of social protest and upheaval, but also a time of really a lot of excitement around the evolution of Gavilan College, which moved from Nash Road at the San Benito High School site to what's now the Hollister Airport, and finally to our present site. And now we're moving into the 1970s. You said that the 1970s were really important for Gavilan. Why is that?
Well, I guess the big answer is that the 60s were just so full of turmoil and change and moving and getting settled, and the 70s were really a time when the college found its identity, or at least found an identity that has continued to change. It was an important time for higher education in general. A statistic I think will kind of illustrate this. In 1920, 4.5% of the population went to college. And, they were mostly white males, some white females. By 1970, that was 25%. So everything has changed. And Gavilan's size doubled between 1971 and 1982. The full-time faculty went from 49 to 70. Part-time faculty doubled from 40 to more than 80. So it's this huge period of growth and expansion. And then there's the climate. You probably remember in the 60s, everybody questioned everything, and everything kind of got thrown up in the air and came down different. And there was a real push for access. And this is where, in California, a philosophy called ability to benefit, which I really like, and I still agree with, although it's more contested today, that is that anybody who had the ability to benefit from college education should be welcome to come here. That kind of became the norm in California, and the state funded that, which meant that all sorts of new populations, students of color, immigrant students, students with disabilities, women who were in their 40s with, 6 kids, all of these people were not only welcomed here, but programs were put in place to make it possible for them to come. And that is new in human history, not just U.S. history, not just California history, but that's really new. And then you need new programs to serve these populations and new academic programs to remain relevant and to meet their needs, and probably some new approaches to engage students and, not teach down, and to use people's life experience. So it was just a really vibrant decade for the college.
And that really includes a new educational philosophy then, right? That, like you said, the approach really was a different. It wasn't the old academic, just strictly academic orientation. It was an orientation toward addressing people in across our population.
In higher education throughout the United States, and now we can include Mexico and Europe and everywhere, there was a push for relevance. Instead of learning about people who had been dead for 3,000 years and what they wrote on some scroll, could we learn about the war that our country is involved in and that we're paying for with our taxes? Could we learn about our own literature, whoever we are, so that we don't just get the canon of so-called dead white men? So there was just this overturning of a lot of kind of educational and academic norms that was very exciting, unless you didn't like it, in which case it was very exciting in not so positive a way.
So there were a lot of changes going on, and there was even a change in the name of the college.
Yes. So it was founded in 1919 as San Benito Junior College, which is what they were all called, and that really reflected the mission. We're a kind of mini college. We're smaller, and we're also less ambitious than a 4-year college, and we prepare people either for work or they go on to their last 2 years of college. And then in the 1950s, they dropped the junior, and they became San Benito College. It was more dignified. It was kind of a movement of the time. And then when Gavilan was founded in 1963, it was the Gavilan Joint Junior College District. That junior crept back in. I'm not sure how. I mean, I think by then a lot of other colleges were dropping it. And then in January of 1971, the Board of Trustees just kind of bowed to the trend, and it became Gavilan Joint Community College District. So it's a shift in approach, really. Yeah, it's not just a name change. It's really, I think, significant enough to spend a minute. It was a shift in approach. It went from being a joint college to a community college, and the insertion of that word community has all sorts of implications for what you are, who you serve, the kinds of things that you do, and your scope. I mean, it opens it up to everything. And if you look at the community colleges in California, at one time or another, they did, sooner or later, somebody offered everything. I mean, it was truly a community place. And everybody came here, from retirees to women in mid-career to, 14-year-olds who didn't like their high school, everybody in between.
So all of this growth and these kinds of changes must have brought some stressors on as well.
They definitely developed, yes. One stressor that people now maybe don't think so much about, because community colleges, or at least ours, probably de-emphasizes vocational now because of things that happened historically, but they really had trouble finding the best current vocational trends to invest in. There was a construction technology program here, very successful for a long time, and then union requirements changed and it became harder to get a job after you graduated with a union job, and so that kind of was laid down. And there was an electronic assembly program here for a while, and then all of that went overseas. But it was an attempt to respond to Silicon Valley and have something that would be useful there. There was also a vet prep program in animal husbandry that included, I'm not sure I'm going to say it right, it's such an old word, farrier?
Yeah. So you learn how to be a farrier.
Yeah, a farrier, yes.
A horse shoer.
Yes.
Yeah.
So people were shoeing horses. There are a lot of horses in this area. So they tried a lot of different things vocationally. They tried an EMT program, and a lot of things didn't stick. So that was one challenge. They also had incredible enrollment pressures all through the 60s and 70s. I think the college officials felt that they had to justify this big, beautiful new campus with all these expenditures. I mean, you're really sticking your neck out when you build a new college. And they really hoped that if they build it, students would come. But they were counting every head, and they were really trying to make sure that they had high enrollment. So the enrollment pressures were unbelievable. They were very nervous for a long time. And that didn't really subside until the late 70s. And then a parallel and probably related concern was the administrators were absolutely paranoid that the college offer an extremely rigorous program academically. They wanted to make sure that Gavilan students would not be humiliated when they transferred to the UCs and the CSUs. And so there was extensive surveillance by the deans. College professors here shut the doors when they were lecturing because the deans would be lurking outside listening to try to see, what are they saying and, how are they teaching it. They would come around and check with a checklist, on final exam day to make sure that you weren't having a party in your class, that you were actually giving a final and that students were sitting there sweating. It was a big concern. And then another concern as the 70s wore on was the deteriorating relationship between faculty and administrators. And there were a lot of factors here, personalities and the times. But one thing that really kicked it off at Gavilan was two faculty were involved in some anti-Vietnam War protests, which they organized on campus. And tensions between these two faculty and administrators, especially the college president, Ralph Schroeder, escalated to the point that he terminated their positions. So they fought for their jobs. They argued that they had free speech rights. And one of the cases didn't really go anywhere for reasons that I won't go into, but one of the cases was Ted Schroeder, who was a very, very popular professor here. And he went back home to New York for a year and cleaned out phone booths to make a living. And one of the faculty who were sympathetic to him, I guess, funded a legal challenge, which he won. and he was reinstated. He came back for a year, but I can imagine he spent the year looking for another job because it was more a moral victory than one that he wanted to actually commit to for the rest of his life. And he left at some point. But the conservatism of the board and of the administrators and their paternalism, there was a dress code for faculty. You couldn't wear sandals if you were a man or a woman, even if it was 97 in the shade. And, you had to get a note from your dean if you had a dentist appointment during the day. You couldn't leave early. I mean, it was a world that you and I have never had to experience, and faculty resented it. So complicating that was that the college prided itself on paying rock-bottom prices for faculty. It was probably one of the worst in the state, according to Kent Child. And then, the board took great delight in this very conservative community in returning any tax revenues that it had not spent to the taxpayers. So they're giving money back, and the faculty and the staff are living on beans. And so that doesn't feel very good. And faculty and staff were pretty powerless until collective bargaining occurred. So the relationships deteriorated. It got to a point where Ralph Schroeder was so resentful of a couple of the more outspoken faculty like Georgette Paris Smith and Ted Rempel that when new people were hired, Kent Child tells when he was hired, he was called into Schroeder's office and warned specifically about the troublemaking faculty, and they were named, stay away from these people. So, of course, you tell most faculty that those are the people they seek out, where we tend to kind of want to know, what we're being warned against. So it was a hard time, all in all.
It's amazing that Ralph Schroeder, who was such an important figure earlier on, became this sort of, I'm sure from the faculty's point, almost a villain. Just this sort of mistrust that seemed to pervade the atmosphere between administration and faculty here.
It really did, but I have to say, as we'll probably discuss in a few minutes, he was absolutely open and wonderful with the students. And he loved the Chicano activist students. He just loved them and gave them everything they asked for. So it's not a simple picture.
Right.
And I tend to think personality probably played a role. He did really well when he was the college president, and the faculty just kind of shut up and taught their classes. And when his decisions and his leadership were challenged more, that's when it didn't work as well. And he had a temper.
Mm-hmm. So what led ultimately to his departure then?
Well, there's a turning point, I think, that's pretty specific. In 1974, yet another accreditation report. He must have looked back on his life and damn those accreditation reports. It said that there was a lack of communication between the administrators and the faculty, and had some pretty specific points about his lack of rapport with faculty. So the board gave him a 1-year notice, and he felt rejected, as well he should, and felt pushed out. It was a new board. It wasn't the board that he had been with since the difficult beginning that, they had worked everything out together. There were new people on it. I think they felt he was out of step with the times. Nobody had done more for the college, and even people who resented his style had to acknowledge that. And so the Student Center was named for him, and that's one thing I'd like to do at some point. I'd really like to have that be a more prominent honor, because really Ralph Schroeder, without his work and his vision and his tireless advocacy, this place wouldn't exist. So I think we should all be more aware that the Student Center is the Ralph Schroeder Student Center, and I'd like to get a plaque or something that kind of acknowledges that. In any case, when he left, there was a purge of his administrators because they tended to many of them saw the world kind of as he did, and they had retreat rights back into the faculty, so that was controversial. So some of them stayed and managed to kind of make a world for themselves, and some of them were not so popular.
So who replaced Schroeder then, and how did that go?
Well, this is a beautiful part of the Gavilan story. An Italian-American former Navy Seabee named Rudy Malone, who'd had a pretty difficult childhood, committed himself to education, put himself through college and a master's program on the GI Bill, and then came to UC Berkeley for his doctorate. He helped found Pima Community College in Tucson, which is a huge, successful community college. He was a dean at Skyline, and he was brought in because the staff was so unhappy, and he had such a charming, pleasing, wonderful personality, apparently. He was really popular from the beginning. He was cosmopolitan. He was affable. His way of doing things, Bonnie Simonson would remember, was, not, okay, go do this. It was, how can we do this together? He was very collaborative, and it didn't hurt that he was so much more, kind of worldly, I guess, than former administrators. There were lots of parties at his house by the pool with a lot of wine and everybody in their bathing suit, especially some of the new female hires were mentioned specifically. It's so nice to have them there in their bathing suits, apparently, for some of the male faculty. So, that's just a different world everybody felt listened to. Plus, the guy had good ideas. He really believed in faculty professional development. He reorganized the college. He was very interested in community relations, and, we could talk for an hour about his role organizing the first Garlic Festival, and it was basically his idea. His wife kind of told me that story. He got the idea reading the newspaper, and he saw that there was a Garlic Festival in France, and he was kind of mad. He said, well, what are they doing having a garlic? We're in Gilroy. We should have a Garlic Festival. So he started floating the idea, and he had enough friends in the community that even though they thought he was crazy, they liked him. So they said, okay, and they planned for 5,000 people. They had it out on that property that's now on 101. They planned for 5,000 and 15,000 came.
In the first one.
Yeah, and it was hot as hell. Karen Sato was there serving, I think, pasta al pesto or something. And, people were running to the grocery store and buying, huge gallons of olive oil because they didn't plan for 15,000 people. Yeah. So it's quite a story. And, it's been an incredible addition to this community.
He sounds like the perfect hire on the heels of Schroeder. Then you had this very different style of a leader, and it sounds like just what the college needed.
It really was just what the college needed. And there's a story that Gloria, his wife and widow, tells that I think it's worth taking a minute to tell, because Rudy Malone really gave this college a lot, and I think we should look at this story. There was a group of Chicano activists in town who wanted to start a nonprofit housing agency, which eventually became the major South County major housing in town, and it has been taken over by Eden Housing. But he went to their meeting. He wasn't invited, but he introduced himself. And his wife said, there's this white person coming in. People don't know him. They wonder, who is he? Why is he here? It's the usual suspicions of people who've been ignored or taken advantage of. But he just sat there and listened. And they wanted to start an organization, but they didn't seem to, maybe have all the skills. So he offered his services, and he wrote grants and proposals for them. He was very good at dealing with government bureaucracies. And he helped launch them, and he carried the papers himself, the incorporation papers, to Sacramento. And, this group became Rudy Malone fans, and then built housing that hundreds of people in our community have lived in. So that wasn't even his job. That's beyond what he was doing at Gavilan. But he saw the community. He understood the community part of a community college, and he was extremely active in making sure that if there was something important that the community needed, he was involved, or the college was involved in helping bring that about. So he was really apparently a remarkable college president and a remarkable person.
So meanwhile, there's a shift in the power. Maybe tell me if you think this is right. There's kind of a shift in the power dynamic as collective bargaining becomes a thing with faculty. How did that change things at the college?
It changed things for faculty enormously. In California, something called the Rhoda Act passed in 1976 that enabled collective bargaining for the first time. And I think you have to understand, before that, there were guild-type organizations on campus. The classified staff had kind of a guild, and the faculty had kind of a guild. And they didn't have legal power, and they honestly didn't really have much actual power from what I've heard. Membership was optional, and they had social events, and they tried to advocate for faculty on salary and schedule issues, but they had no power. They could easily be swept away or ignored, and they had no way to, kind of ensure that what they wanted was heard. And Bob Funk says there was a lot of yelling and a lot of cussing, and then the faculty had to basically take what was handed to them by administrators. Sometimes they could use reason or out-yell somebody, but it was a different world. And in early 1977, the classified staff formed a union, the classified CSEA, Classified Staff Employees Association, I think. And then by June, the faculty followed suit and formed the Gavilan College Faculty Association. And for the first 5 or 6 years, really, the classified union was a lot stronger. They were better organized. They put effort in and really went to the bargaining table, knowing their stuff. Unfortunately for them, apparently they organized a strike effort in the early 80s that failed because they had open membership and not enough people went on strike. And then they had to spend a decade or so kind of reorganizing themselves, and that's going to have some repercussions in the 90s, which we'll talk about later. But the faculty really had an uphill battle. Malone may have been expressing the views of the board. Maybe these were his own views, although I kind of doubt it. I think he probably was a little more tempered in his approach. But the board was horrified. I mean, they started years before the Rhoda Act. I mean, they passed something in 1975 saying, we don't want collective bargaining. Don't come here. It's a resolution. It would not be good for our college. But, you can't fight against a tide. So Malone made a speech the night that the board had to accept it. I mean, it was the law, and said that he was concerned that relations would become hostile and he really wanted the good of the college. And it was prophetic in some ways. I mean, that's exactly what happened. And the first thing that the administration did, and again, was this Malone on his own, or was this the board telling him to do, or was this them working together? There were 70 faculty full-time who were eligible for membership, and the very first thing the administration did was take 15 of them and offer them kind of quasi-administrative positions that also involved some teaching, and then they were out of the bargaining unit. So the faculty went all the way to, I think, at least to the state. I don't know if they went to the National Labor Relations Board to challenge this, and lost. So it was ruled that these people, even though they were doing some teaching, still were legitimately administrators. And this was a terribly effective, let's put it that way, on the part of the administration, because it really, people who had been friends, it really split them. Kent Child recalls, coming to work one morning, everybody's friends and happy, and they go eat lunch together. The next morning, nobody will look at him because he's one of the people who's become an administrator, which is interesting to think about in our time. You think, oh, well, people are different. I don't think they're any different. I think faculty are threatened when other faculty rise above them and try to supervise them.
And that's a big number, 15. So suddenly you have 15 more administrators on a campus with 70 faculty.
And it
or 55.
It weakens the union. At the same time, it strengthens the administration. At one point, Jim Williams wrote a report sometime in the early 80s. And at one point, he said there were 27 management and 61 faculty, which is that's a little skewed. They legitimately said this is not good. So. The faculty story, though, is there was a turning point after the classified staff union was broken. I guess the unions were not too they didn't have too much credibility on campus. And then there was a board meeting in 1984 when the faculty came with some requests or demands, I don't know, and they were laughed at openly by the board. And that was it. I mean, you have all these alpha males that they weren't going to be laughed at anymore. So Don Santana, Ludo Oliveira, Jerry Fluke, they looked at each other and they said, okay, we're going to make this union real. And they did. They improved salary and working conditions, and it became a pretty effective union. When I came in 1990, I would describe it as an extremely effective and efficient brotherhood. of guys who had been there a long time. They had their own vocabulary, they had codes, they understood each other, and they had their habits. It was often quite adversarial. When I came in 1990, the college was trying to charge a $100 parking fee, which really angered the faculty because they had never had, there's enough parking here. There's plenty of parking. And it was a dignity issue. Are they going to? So the faculty were constantly, Ludo Olivier would make these big buttons that said, work to contract or, no cooperation until we get a raise or things like that. So there was kind of constant tension.
Mm-hmm. So what other changes were going on at the college meanwhile then?
Well, I think the most important thing that happened in California in the 1970s is Prop 13 in 1978, which the voters approved and which resulted in a sickening loss of property tax revenue for every public agency and for colleges, and for this college, it was truly awful. Gavilan lost 60% of its operating revenue. And, that's just awful. I mean, it was programs started to go. It was very bad for morale. From this kind of golden era where everybody can come in and you're trying to do everything for everybody and you have state funding to do that, suddenly the district had to freeze salaries. There were no sabbaticals. But you can't freeze salaries without negotiating it, and that's illegal. So the district had to be forced to the negotiating table. And when there's not any money and you're negotiating, things are really ugly. It was awful. It was truly awful.
So one of the things that you wrote about about the 1970s, but it strikes me throughout the history of the college, is the issue of poverty in Gilroy and in surrounding areas and how that shaped the college's history. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, we have all these measures today for poverty, and in the 20s, 30s, and 40s, these are such rural areas that poor students didn't necessarily know they were poor. They had enough to eat. Mm-hmm. And so that really changed because of sociological, demographic changes and so forth. And the 70s ushered in new students, and many, many Gavilan students over the years and San Benito Junior College students were the first in their families to go to college. And they weren't rich families because those families would have sent their kids to Berkeley or UCLA or Stanford. But truly poor families. I mean, I talked to people who had 11 siblings or, 8 siblings. And, I don't care what the parents do, those families are not going to have extra cash. But those families, for the first time in the 70s, because of the open access, free tuition, and the fact that it was pretty convenient, could send their kids to college. So in 1970, in a resolution to support an EOPS program, which was new on campus and new in the state, really, I think the EOPS programs were kind of getting going in the second half of the 60s. They documented that 35% of the students at the college were at the poverty level, and that unemployment that year was higher than it was in Watts, that's pretty high. And, that's partly because people were coming to college who had never had a chance before. A lot of farm workers in this area who couldn't dreamed of college for their children. And so that same year, the college had 41% of the students self-reporting as members of ethnic minorities. And the biggest minority in this area, of course, at that time, and probably still today, is Mexican Americans, Chicanos/Mexicanos. So the EOPS program was born to help those students. Students who are educationally or economically disadvantaged still benefit from EOPS. And, the college was able to offer work study. There were federal funds to help people who never had a chance before. And it worked. A whole generation of Chicano and low-income and immigrant students went to college.
What I'm hearing really is that it's an expansion of an idea that really took hold right at the beginning of the history of the college. and it just provided the same opportunity, or it provided new opportunities for just a much greater group of people.
Yes, although I think what's different in the 70s is that there was more self-consciousness about we are specifically helping people who have been excluded. I mean, that was the philosophy from the beginning. But even with that philosophy and free tuition, Mexican-American families had to work. I mean, they couldn't spare the kid going to college. And here, federal programs made it possible for that college-age child to have federal work study, to get EOPS help with books. I mean, these programs literally made college possible.
So it's really a new attention to excluded populations.
Yes.
Previously excluded.
Yes. And then once these people get here, they look around and they say, there aren't too many of us here. Let's open the doors even wider. So we have Margaret Morales Rebecki, who came in the early 70s, who had a good experience in high school. There was a Mayo Club, a Mexican-American youth organization club at Gilroy High School, and many of the people I talked to had kind of politicizing experiences at that club. She got to Gavilan, she looked around, she said, no Chicano studies, no Chicano history, no ballet folklorico. We want a, Spanish language music class. And she organized. She was either the first or the second president of Metro. We think she was the first. The Movimiento Estudiantil Chicano de Aztlán, which is the movement of college students to organize for a variety of kind of improvements for Chicano students. And here, they were guided by a brand new hire, Gilberto Segovia, who was hired to teach Spanish. He taught Chicano studies. She tells a wonderful story. She had good relations with Ralph Schroeder. He really liked the students in this group. And she decided that she was going to go and have a polite conversation with him about these classes that she'd like to have offered. And she told some of her fellow mechistas, I've got an appointment with Schroeder. So they said, okay, let's go, let's sit in. And she's like, well, no, I was. So they went and sat in his office, and he took it in stride. It didn't ruffle him. They were all around the floor on his office, and they chanted a little. And so he asked them what they wanted, and they had their list of demandas. They had their demands, and they finished their list. And he said, "Okay, we can do that." That's what I love about Gavilan. Yeah. There was no argument. Okay, we'll do it.
Yeah,
and he did it.
Yeah, and that's the other side of Ralph Schroeder too, right?
Yeah, I think it's really important. These demands were bitterly fought. And, these students were, persecuted at other colleges. And here, they sat in on his office. He said, yeah, let's do it. He lifted weights with them. I mean, it's a totally different story.
Yeah.
They felt they were heard here.
So another population that it was brought into Gavilan was the disabled students. There's a disabled student program that came together at that time. And could you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah. I think it's really important to recognize the people who stuck their necks out here. I mean, there's a lot of necks sticking out. Carol Cooper was I think at that time a part-time counselor at Gavilan with a particular interest in disability, and she had had some training, and special education was an emerging field. The federal government funded, through a Vocational Education Act, helping students with disabilities learn vocational skills, and Gavilan was turning away this money every year. And she kind of noticed that, and she said, well, this is ridiculous. So she asked if she could do a feasibility study. And she was given permission, and she did a very good job. She did a very good job with everything she ever did. And she found that there was an urgent need for services in this community. No surprise. There were people living at home, dependent on their families. There were people who were Vietnam vets. There were people who were blind, deaf, and no services whatsoever. There was a K through 12 program called Gateway, but once they were through with that program, people had nothing. So she convinced the college to begin a program, and there were 4 new hires, all part-time, in 1974. And she made brilliant choices as far as who she hired. The 2 part-time faculty were Dave Ellis and Noni Gamino, And they both were extremely effective. Dave was just an old jock from San Jose State who knew every jock and did kind of physical rehab. They also did vocational. And Dave was just this sunny, kind of lovable face of the disabled program. And he won over a lot of people who were kind of skeptical. I have to say there was one faculty person in particular who I will not name, who appointed himself the number one enemy of this program and didn't see why a college campus should be helping people who, were developmentally disabled, although in those days the terms that were used were much less respectful and much more insulting. And so he fought it every step of the way. I mean, he really appointed himself opposition in chief. And it was one of Carol Cooper's sweet victories that after a few years, because the flood of students and the gratitude of the parents and the blossoming of the students who were part of this program, who were being given intellectual and physical challenges and opportunities they could never have dreamed of, it even made a convert of this faculty person. So that was sweet, I think, for Carol Cooper. So the program just grew and grew. I mean, they got involved in Special Olympics. It was a wonderful addition to the college and still is a huge part of what we do.
I'm sure the inclusion of that population changed the culture of the campus in some ways. Do you think?
I think so, although I think a lot of the changes were hard. This campus is built on hills. So what you and I navigate without thinking too much about it, there's some pretty steep kind of gravelly ups and downs here. And it took a long time for those ramps to get built. Mm-hmm. It took a long time. Carol Cooper was incredibly patient, and she was very strategic, really savvy. For years, she went to every service club. She ate a lot of rubber chicken, and she got outside funding for a lot of the things that she wanted because she got it that, she was going to be perceived as even more of a threat if she tried to get inside funding. So she went out, wrote grants, and got service clubs to fund an awful lot of what was here.
Mm-hmm. And how about the students? Do you think the students were how do you have information about how much they accepted disabled students on their campus, and did they help promote or change the attitudes?
It's a good question. I don't have macro information. I mean, I talk to individuals. Mm-hmm. Like I talked to Karen Sato, who came here when she was 17 and thought, she was interested. She took an American Sign Language class, and Carol Cooper was actually in the class and was impressed by Karen's personality and offered her a job as basically what we today would call a mobility aid, helping people in wheelchairs around campus. Mm. And Karen tells a story, of having the stereotype of this kind of withdrawn, depressed person, kind of feeble in a wheelchair. She walks in, there's this Vietnam vet, a woman with a big, gravelly, booming voice who's popping wheelies on her wheelchair. And she doesn't need Karen for much. She's ordering her around. She's telling her to do this, do that. And she's a tough dame, as Karen tells it. Nothing like the stereotype that Karen had. Yeah. So I have to think that just having people around, and a lot of Vietnam vets, had to change the perceptions.
There was still so much going on in the 70s politically, the war and civil rights issues, and how engaged were students politically at that time?
It's hard to say. I think they certainly had opportunities, and there are definitely signs of engagement at Gavilan at that time. I mean, Cesar Chavez came, which really ruffled people in the community. Wow. He's public enemy number one in this period in San Benito County. But Georgette Paris Smith worked with the students and got them to come. And he was not a stranger to this area. He was doing marches and stuff. But to bring him to the college campus gave him, I guess in some people's eyes, a legitimacy that they would rather have denied him. So he came. Ralph Nader came. By now, the college had a population of international students and experimented with some different language programs. At one point, Tagalog was taught here. At another point, they were teaching Farsi. And they had a very popular event called the International Cafe, where the international students danced or sang or, did what they did. And other people dressed up as, Dutch students and sang a Dutch song or whatever. Having Vietnam veterans on campus, I think, was good for everybody. It was good for the vets. It was good for the younger students. It was good for the college. And it has to raise discussion about Vietnam. And then these two faculty people who tried to raise that discussion and got fired, these are political times. And, students mobilized, I think, to support them. It was a very intense and interesting time. And for women, Bettina Abthecker came, and I believe she taught the first women's studies class here. Mm. And some of the women in that class were just amazed and astonished and inspired, and it was a life-changing class. It wasn't a big group either. They started a battered women's shelter that grew into Community Solutions, which is the biggest service provider in South County. It has more than 100 employees, and it's unionized today. A lot of things were happening here.
Another impact of community colleges, right?
If we traced all our impacts, well, it would be impossible, but we would be here a long time. Yeah.
What about ethnic relationships? Were there tensions at that time?
There were certainly tensions in the high school. I've certainly heard a lot about that. I haven't really heard about ethnic tensions. What I've heard instead ranges from, everybody knew everybody in high school. We were all so used to each other that even though there were, European American kids and Mexican American kids, there were also people who went between the groups, and lots of them, not just a few. There were lots of students who had friendships in both. Pat Stevens, European American, he was part Portuguese and part kind of a mix, country boy from Hollister, tells a remarkable story. He was a college wrestler, and he actually reminds us that in 1973, the year that Gavilan, which we'll talk about in a minute, was the best football team in the United States for community colleges, that Gavilan also won state in wrestling. And he tells a story of going in, he's going out for wrestling on the first day, gets his locker assignment, goes to his locker. There's a very large African-American athlete next to him, and the guy's shoes are in front of Pat's locker. And the guy is engaging in this very spicy kind of antagonistic dialogue at full voice with another African-American athlete across the locker room. And Pat was terrified. Uh-huh. He grew up in Hollister. He said, I had never been around black people. I thought he was going to kill me. I was like, so he stood there a minute and watched these guys screaming at each other. And then the guy next to him turned to him and said, oh, are my shoes in your way? So Pat said, well, yeah, I got to get to my locker. And the guy said, don't worry, little guy. He put his arm around Pat and hugged him. We're okay, So it would, more than one person told me this is their first experience with anybody African-American. In Hollister, there were a few families apparently, but not many people who were African-American lived in Hollister. Yeah. So what I love about Gavilan is that the students don't come from a really enriched cultural environment like you might have in Oakland or San Francisco, but in some ways that makes people really open.
Right.
And I see it again and again when people talk about the 70s at Gavilan. Mm-hmm. I have another example of John Pettis, who grew up just poor as a church mouse, as they used to say. Smart kid, rose to the top of every class he ever took, was part of this group at Gilroy High, was politicized, was really interested in the civil rights movement, started to do some advocacy at Gilroy High for Chicano students, and kind of started to find his voice and stand up for himself. Then he came to Gavilan, and he actually in the 60s was over at the airport campus. And A, he had no car, too poor, so he's riding the bus. B, he's working as a trucker every day that he doesn't have classes, so he's working his tail off to be able to afford this. And then C, the classes are a lot more demanding. So even a really good student has to put in a lot of hours studying. So, he didn't date. Well, he didn't have a car, so dating was, you kind of needed a car. And he found Gavilan not that active politically, but he didn't have time. He had to do his studies and do it. So even somebody who's very politically conscious remember, so many of them are the first in their families to go to college. They need to succeed at college. That has to come first for them. Or things are going to be a lot more difficult for their younger brothers and sisters. Things are going to be a lot more difficult for them. They're looking at factory jobs or farm work jobs. So they have to succeed academically. And what John did is kind of deferred the political activity for later. And then he picked right up and continued it. But he couldn't really do it at Gavilan.
At the same time, you have this. There's this dichotomy. There's this very conservative community that doesn't want Cesar Chavez to come and speak, and on the other hand, you have a college president who almost doesn't invite students to come sit in, but listens to them and accedes to all of their demands, and you have a climate in some ways that it doesn't sound like there was a lot of ethnic tension on our campus, in spite of this really conservative community.
I'm sure there were instances of it, but what I heard over and over and over again is, I was a serious student. I surrounded myself with serious students. All I saw were serious students at Gavilan.
Okay.
And some of these other things happened. There were these demonstrations against the Vietnam War, but people had to be serious students. There was a lot at stake for a lot of these families who were sacrificing even to enable one of their members to go to a community college that was local. That's still a sacrifice for these families.
And it still is.
And it still is. And so people took it seriously. The education part was taken really seriously.
And so is the football.
Oh, yes, the football. Glad you brought that up. So, Bobby Garcia, who we encountered in the 1950s as another extremely kid from a very poor family, a single mom who became a strawberry farmer, and 5 older sisters had to quit going to school, although one of them did go back and become a nurse. Really bright family, really bright, organized, disciplined mother. She became the largest strawberry farmer in Northern California by the end of her life. Anyway, they got up at 5 and went and worked in the strawberry fields and then went to school. And he got involved in sports, and his mother didn't support it. It didn't put bread on the table. And so he kind of had to do it in spite of that. And came to Gavilan after he had been in the service. So he was a little older. Little guy, really dynamic, really charismatic, became, the record holder for number of steals per basketball game, and could, played football, played baseball, was a very good athlete. He tells some remarkable stories that I probably don't have time to go into, but a kind of a deal was made between him and Ralph Schroeder. Schroeder told him, keep your nose clean when you come back to Gavilan after going away for your bachelor's and your master's. There will be a job for you, because Bobby Garcia had a work ethic that just didn't stop. And he demonstrated this by cleaning the cafeteria as a work-study student, and Schroeder was impressed by this. So he went away. He got his bachelor's and his master's. He came back. He got a job coaching. He eventually became the head football coach. And there was a perception of him in the community that I think is really true. Well, first of all, he knew everybody. He had either picked their strawberries or, sold them strawberries or whatever. He knew everybody. He was from this community. And he really cared about his students. And so when he and Paul Latsky, another local boy made good, Paul Latsky had played for the San Diego Chargers, and was a offensive coach. Linebackers, and now I'm getting, the offensive line. So he apparently he was the best offensive line coach that Bobby Garcia has ever seen, and Bobby Garcia has gone all the way to all of the top Super Bowl teams. So Bobby knows. So they started recruiting, and they went to the high schools and they recruited, and they got a pretty motley crew. They got a couple who had never played football before. They got a guy who was 5'5", who was their kicker and their mascot. There was a pipeline established. So people were coming from Steubenville, Ohio, where Jerry Fluke had established contacts. So the coaches had to call you. You couldn't call them. That was a violation of Coast Conference rules. But the coaches called, and so they sent their often African-American students here to play football. So he put together a very motley crew. He had kids who had played defensive in high school playing offensive. Ray Sanchez tells about having to gain, I think, 80 pounds in order to play the new role and being willing to do it because Coach Bobby really... And Bobby Garcia was... I mean, I wish there had been a film crew there. I mean, his locker room antics are legendary. I mean, there was the time when he gave them a talk, I think it was before the game, about how many minutes. Are there 60 minutes in a football hour? I'm not a football fan, so I don't know. There's 60 minutes, and every single goddamn one of those minutes has got to count. And, this big, and then in the end of the talk, he took off a very nice-looking watch, and he threw it to the ground in a dramatic finale, and everybody was like, oh my God, he cares so much, he's going to break his watch. He was so carried away. Years later, he told them that it was a pawn shop watch that it wasn't even his watch. But boy, it made an impression. Ken Pierce said, I had never seen anything like that, and boy, was I charged. So the result of all this, these guys bonding and the coaches working deeply with each player. I mean, the players really felt like they were understood by these coaches, and the coaches cared, and the coaches were really watching them and helping them be their best players. They won game after game after game after game. And by the end of the season, there was not an actual game where you played and you became the national champion, but there were rankings, and there was a publication that came out with the rankings. They were number 4 in the country, which was pretty wonderful. They knew that, and they went off to play, I think it was a bowl game against Miracosta, and it's all about who you're playing and who they've beaten and who's beaten them. And Miracosta was pretty high up there, and they beat Miracosta. And it was a miracle. Miracosta had a big, beefy, well-funded and, professionally coached football team. Gavilan beat them. So the rankings came out the following week, and Gavilan was number 1. And these guys, it's hard to describe enough what underdogs they were. I mean, one of them had a wife and 2 children, and he was playing football. And they were from poor families, and they had never had academic success necessarily or any other kind of success, and they just coalesced, which is what has to happen on that kind of a team. But it was a dream team, and the coaches were dream coaches, and how those coaches worked with those kids probably could teach us all a lot about motivation and teaching. And there are 2 codicils to the story. One is that Bobby went to Ralph Schroeder, who must have been very proud. He's the one who gave Bobby Garcia his start coaching and had hired him and said, hey, I'd really like to get my team some rings, for the season. And Schroeder, I think, very honestly said, Bobby, I have given you every cent that was to spare on this because they had to send them, in buses and all over. And there was just no money. So Bobby turned to his community, and pretty soon a breakfast was organized, and all the football players came to the breakfast, and each football player received a really beautiful ring with a very pretty blue stone. And, 45 years later, when I sat down to talk to Ken Pierce, he had this box very carefully wrapped and inside in tissue paper, which he carefully unwrapped, and he laid on the table his ring. And he said, I don't take it out much. It's a prized possession for me. I mean, this is so meaningful to these players. And then the other part of the story, the last part of the story, is at the Coast Conference, somebody didn't like Bobby. They called him Coach Bobby's Outlaws because they also had a lot of fights after these guys. They described it as war, organized war on the football field. They had a lot of anger. They were poor kids. They played some pretty rich colleges. When San Francisco City College came to play at Gavilan, they had 3 buses and all these accoutrements, and they mooed as they got off the bus to communicate their disdain for the cow town that they were visiting and the cowboys who they were going to surely beat. Yeah. So Gavilan whipped their butts. Yeah. And as they got back on their 3 buses with their heads hanging, Bobby Garcia couldn't resist. He stood there and he mooed. He mooed them out of town. But anyway, there had to be some animosity, and so their eligibility was challenged based on some players who came from out of state. And they had checked on these players' eligibility with the Coast Conference going into the season and had received okays. So Paul Latsky sued him and won. And their title was defended. But somebody had to kind of, try to ruin it.
Yeah.
They failed,
Yeah.
but good for Paul Latsky.
Yeah. The ring story kind of brings me back to, this is really a college situated in its community, right? And there is a relationship to the community that is enduring. And I think that's a kind of a theme that pervades your story.
For things to work well, one of the things I've seen, people have to maintain civility and they have to talk to each other. And that's one of the wonderful things about this college and this area, that dialogue has been pretty open, at least historically. I'm not sure that it is now. But enough local people worked here and enough local people cared about the college to get involved in various capacities as volunteers that dialogue was really possible. And I hope it never goes away, because then you really lose the support and all of the benefits you get by being part of a community.
Well, thank you very much for taking us on the journey through the 1970s at Gavilan College. We look forward to next week's podcast.
Thank you.